I'm so glad you're here. I'm just finishing up grading some papers. And the papers I'm grading today are on differences between viruses and bacteria. And I have to tell you, they didn't do so well. I want to teach you the differences between viruses and bacteria, so maybe you can come and teach my students. Viruses and bacteria are what we would describe as germs. And these are the germs that we think about when we think about getting sick. And people are often confused between bacteria and viruses, but they're actually very different than each other. They do have some similarities, so let's think about the similarities first. They're both microscopic, meaning very, very small, so we need a microscope to see them. They both do cause and can cause very severe illness. They can cause illness in humans like us. They can cause illness in animals like this little dog here. And even plants have bacterial and viral illnesses that can be problems for them. There are going to be different types of viruses and bacteria that infect the different species, but they all can cause a lot of trouble. Let's think about some ways that they're different than each other. So I said that they're both microscopic. That's true, but they actually are very different size-wise. So bacterial cells are actually very large compared to viruses. Bacterial cells can be sometimes 200 times larger than viruses, which is really interesting. But again, still both microscopic. Bacterial cells are very unique in that they are alive. They're individual cells. They're able to reproduce on their own. So if we call our little M&M, yay, candy, a bacterial cell, this bacterial cell can reproduce. Take one and then you make two out of that. These two would then go on to make four, and they're going to continue to reproduce in this way. So they can reproduce on their own, and then they can cause infections in people. Bacterial cells are interesting too because they actually can be good for us. We have bacterial cells that live all over our bodies, on our skin. There's bacterial cells that live in our intestines. They're called normal flora, and they're actually really important. They help us to break down food and even produce vitamins like vitamin K for us. So they can be good too. So these are bacterial cells, so they are able to reproduce on their own, versus viruses. Viruses are not actually living. It's interesting that scientists classify them as something between living and non-living, which is a really interesting place to be. But these viruses, the reason we say that they're in between living and non-living is that they need a host to reproduce. So viruses, they can live on door handles and they can live on hands. And again, if you shake hands with somebody, you can pass a virus to somebody. You sneeze and cough. But once they pass from one person to another, they actually have to get into a cell to reproduce and make more of them. So here's an example of this. So say this is your cell, right? You shook hands with somebody, you touched your eye, and now you have a virus that's invading your cells. Here's your little virus that's going to infect our cell. So what the virus is actually going to do is attach to particular cells. It's going to take this DNA that's inside of the virus, run that down into your cell, and then what the viral DNA will do is take over the manufacturing equipment inside of the cell. So inside the cell, no more are we producing bacterial cells or any type of your own proteins, but now we're making only viruses. So it's essentially a virus factory at this point. So it's no longer performing functions for you. Then what happens is this thing is going to fill up with viruses so much, so baby viral particles are going to fill until we get to the point when bust open, and now we have all of these little baby viruses running around, and they're going to go and infect another cell in your body. So that's how viral infections spread in your body. So viruses need a host cell to reproduce. That's a major difference that we have. How do we treat viruses and how do we treat bacterial cells? Viruses typically are shorter course of illness. You're talking between 2 and 10 days, depending upon how healthy the person was to start with. Bacterial illnesses typically are longer. You're looking at more of a 10-day to 12-day course for bacterial infections. And then how do we treat them? Viruses can be treated only with antivirals, so you can get those from the doctor. But in general, the best way to treat a virus is rest and soup and water, and that's essentially it. So viruses will be taken care of by your immune system if you rest and baby yourself for a little while, versus bacterial infections are treated by antibiotics. So antibiotics are actually really important in getting into and busting open those bacterial cells. Traditionally, most colds and most things that are making you feel bad are viruses. So some common examples of viruses would be the rhinovirus, which is the common cold. That's the upper respiratory infection that most people get. You have influenza, which is a different type of virus that causes more severe fever, body aches. It's more all over that you feel that. And then bacterial infections, you're looking at things like there's a particular type of bacteria that causes ulcers. Helicobacter pylori can cause ulcers. Things that cause food poisoning, Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli can cause food poisoning. Those are bacterial infections. So when you go to the doctor, it's important that you understand that there are particular tests that can be done to determine, do you have a bacterial infection or do you have a viral infection? And the viral infections can only be treated with rest and hydration, antivirals if necessary, but bacterial infections are the ones that require those antibiotics. So those are some major differences, right? We said that they're both microscopic, they both can cause human illness, so we need to have good hand washing, good hygiene to make sure that we don't pass those around. But again, major differences, we're talking size-wise, bacteria are very large compared to viruses, which are very small, and the types of infections that they actually create are going to be very different as well. So hopefully you can use that information in your life and hopefully come and teach my students some stuff too.